So today we're going to talk all about SMT divergences. I'm going to explain to you exactly what it is, how I use them, and exactly how much of a critical role they play in my trading. I use them for stop loss placement. I use them for when to go break even. I use them for when I'm going to take my profit, and I even use them for my bias when I'm coming into the session. So they are extremely crucial and critical in my trading. So the best way for me to explain to you what an SMT is just to move straight to the chart. So let's just go over there right now. So first and most important, I gotta explain to you exactly what an SMT is. So on paper, the definition of an SMT is just when two correlated assets start moving out of sync. So let's say you're trading the NASDAQ. The best example is you're comparing it to the S&P 500 or the Dow Jones Industrial Average, because those two assets should be correlated. They're both like US stock exchanges. They should move in sync in theory, right? They're both correlated against the US dollar as well. So when NASDAQ makes a higher high, the S&P 500 should do the same thing. And if you notice that one of them fails to do that and we start displacing away from that high, that would be an SMT divergence at that point, right? So I'm not going to say everything is an SMT and it's going to hold like the second it happens, but if I'm trading and I see something where I start seeing a reaction away from an SMT, then I'll start putting some consideration into it, right? So there's multiple types of SMTs, right? So the first type of SMT I want to talk about is what I call a session SMT. So it's primarily at session highs and lows, but I also look for SMTs at like previous day high and low and like previous week's high and low, because those are even stronger than these SMTs. But so with these session SMTs, so when I first come into the session, the first thing I'm doing is I'm marking out all the session highs and lows. So I feel like these really strong SMTs, or let's say like we have Asia session and one of them comes up and sweeps Asia, but the other one doesn't, right? So like we had an example of this a couple of days ago, right? So if we look at this Asia high, I marked out the SMT, where NQ was never strong enough to actually come up here and sweep out this high, but ES was strong enough. It swept out that high, and it got a reaction away from that. So, like, obviously, if we're moving in bullish order flow, it's not like they're going to hit at the exact same time, but if you look at ES and go, wow, we're getting a good reaction away from that, I think that SMT might hold, and it lines up with whatever your trading strategy is, right? Because you're not looking at every SMT and saying, wow, we're going to reject here. But if your trading strategy already tells you to take a trade, right, you could use this SMT as another confluence or another confirmation, or you could backtest and see if, oh, maybe I'm winning a higher percentage of the time when my trades have SMTs. So because of that, I might risk higher on these SMT setups. But yeah, so the first thing I'm doing is I'm marking out all the session highs on lows. I'm looking for session SMTs, and I'm saying, oh, like for example, if we swept out a session high or low, delivered away from it, or we're going to continue away from there, right? And in this case, right, I mean, we did continue kind of far away from there. I mean, it's not like you can look at every SMT and say we're going to have a reaction like this, but in this case, it did kind of work. So those are session SMTs, but internally, there's also going to be like internal SMTs, right? So I'm going to use an example from a trade that I actually took today. So I actually ended up taking a 2-minute inversion, right? It was somewhere up here, right? So I used this SMT to kind of frame this trade. I only went for a 1-to-1 in this trade though, but I used this SMT to frame this trade, right? So I said, okay, we're trading inside this higher time frame. Let me make sure I'm looking at the right point, right? Yeah, inside this higher time frame, 15-minute gap, right? It was right here. Inside this higher time 15-minute gap. So we put an SMT inside that gap and started displacing away from it, right? Because we swept these highs up here, didn't go really far past them, and then we put in that SMT with ES, where NQ came up, took out the high, but ES failed to take out that high. So now, that SMT, that session SMT, is pretty far away, but ideally, like best case scenario, right? So you have a session SMT, and then you have an internal SMT. And like the mid ground here is like, there are SMTs that aren't necessarily session SMTs, but I wouldn't really call them internal SMTs, where like, let's say we sweep out a significant low or a significant high, but it's not a session high or low, right? Like for example, like this low down here, very significant low, but it's not necessarily a session high or low. So if we put in an SMT there, I would also call that like significant. But yeah, I mean, so I'm using SMTs in a lot of ways. And I also said I use them for my break even points, right? So obviously, like, so the way I'm using them for stop losses though is, yeah, because I guess I'll just go in order, right, from stop loss to take profit, right? So the way I'm using them for my stop losses is if any trade setup I get involved with has an SMT, like this one here, for example, right? I took this 2-minute. So because there's an SMT near my stop loss, I want to give my stop loss that full SMT, right? The extreme of that SMT. The reason I'm doing this though is because I'm using this SMT as a confirmation. I'm still believing in this setup until this SMT starts failing, right? So today that did save me, because some people, when they take inversions, they like having tight stop losses, right? I would have gotten stopped out, but because I gave it breathing room with that full SMT high or low, that actually allowed me to win this trade. I mean, it was a 1-to-1, but so then for break evens, right? So theoretically, let's say I'm taking like this 5-minute short right here, right? So the way I would use an SMT in terms of break evens would be, so if we're looking at the exact same point on ES, right? Because me personally, I only look for SMTs between NQ and ES. I'm not looking at like the Dow Jones US 30. It's not something I really do. But so let's say if I took this short off this 5-minute inverse, right? I'm not saying I necessarily would. This is a pure example, right? So we enter in that candle close enough, right? So let's say you're in this short. At this point in time, when we see this candle right here, right? See this big one right here? This one never took out this low where my break-even point normally would be, because I like going break-even at the most recent internal high or low. But I would look at ES and be like, oh, wait, on that exact same candle, because like this candle right here is that candle on ES, that candle actually broke that internal low. So at that point, even though we didn't sweep out this low, I'd be going break even, because I know that SMT could hold, right? And there's a lot of times I don't want to risk having that SMT hold, because like this inversion, I'm saying, oh yeah, once this gap gets inverted, it's going to be a strong draw down to this like low down here. But it's not really a strong draw if you start putting in SMT essentially. So yeah, and then I also said I use them for my take profits. So the way I'm using SMTs for my take profit is, I'll find a different setup. Just use as an example. Why not? So let's say I'm taking a long, I'll get rid of these session markings, but let's say I'm trying to take a long here for some reason. I don't know why I'm trying to do this, but let's say I want to take a long here. Let's say I want to target these highs up here, right? Same highs up here, right? So let's say I'm looking, and then I honestly I can't tell which one of them hit first, but let's say that NASDAQ hits where I want to target, my same area of take profit before ES does. That would cause me to either close my position early, or if I have not made it to like a 1-to-1 yet, I would just make sure essentially like my stop loss has to be a break even. But so basically I'm looking at my draw. If ES, the correlated asset, takes the same area I want to target, I'm going to full close. Because there's a lot of times where like, yeah, I feel like you do look kind of stupid sometimes where you're closing like 1 point away, right, from that high. But there are those times where you're so happy that you closed because that SMT ends up holding and you're saying, oh, we're going to run those couple extra points, and then you don't, and you go all the way back to break even, or even worse, you take a loss. Just me personally, I like closing when I know the highest probability portion is over, right? Because like once I enter, I think there's a high probability setup, and the setup starts getting lower probability once we start doing things like that, right? Taking out opposing draws on liquidity that I want to target on the correlated assets. So essentially, just to recap real quick, right? So I use SMTs in a variety of ways, right? I use them for my stop loss, right? I give my stop loss that full SMT low, and me personally, I love taking trades at SMTs. They are highly preferred. Then, if I say I'm going break even in a certain area, if it gets taken on a correlated asset, such as like ES, for example, that's going to make me go break even when either of the instruments hits it. And then for my take profit, if either instrument hits my take profit, that's going to cause me to close early. And if I haven't hit my 1-to-1, I'm going to move it to break even until I can get that 1-to-1. So essentially, when I'm trading, just because I'm only trading the Nasdaq does not mean I'm only looking at the Nasdaq. I'm looking at the S&P 500 very heavily. And one last little tip that I have is sometimes, like let's say if you're unsure of the trend, sometimes the trend will look a lot more clear on like at ES, the S&P 500 compared to NQ, like the Nasdaq, right? Because there are days where I'll be confused on Nasdaq for my bias, and then like I'll mark out these session highs and lows, right? We'll put in that SMT, right? Let's say we'll have an SMT at London or Asia session, right? And then we'll get a clear displacement away from it. If I was zoomed in just looking at NQ, I wouldn't really know that we're getting a clear reaction off London lows, for example, right? Because there are times where I'll take a trade in NQ, but the main reasoning for it is because we're getting a very clear reaction at ES, trading off London lows. We put in the SMT, and I can clearly see that ES is moving away from those very sharply with displacement, right? It's something I'm very confident in, but I don't trade ES, right? And I know that once ES starts moving one way, it's going to pull the NASDAQ along with it, right? Because they're correlated assets. But you can also use this, like let's say you're using gold. You could do the same thing, look for SMTs with like silver, right? You could look at it against the US dollar. And there's even other things where if you're trading Euro USD, you can look at it against GBP USD if you're trading forex. Pretty much whatever pair you trade, just look at what you can look at SMTs against. Just Google it. I'm sure you'll be able to find it. But we're just going to wrap up this video real quick now. So if you were confused with SMTs at all, I really hope that cleared that up, as SMTs are a very useful tool and I highly recommend using them. But before I wrap this video up, I just want to remind you, if you're looking for a prop firm to trade with, my favorite prop firm is Alpha Futures. You can use my discount code TINB272, which is going to get you 10% off any evaluation or whatever the best current discount is. So I highly recommend checking out Alpha Futures. I'm going to put the link down below, as well as my free Discord, which will be linked in the pinned comment. So definitely check that out. But if you watch this all the way through, I'd really appreciate it if you give me a like, put a comment down below, and subscribe. I also just hope you have a great day.